Here we are in March 2025, with my channel sitting at just over 12,700 subscribers. Such a huge number is still mind-blowing to me. Since I don't really do YouTube just for attention, it's simply because I enjoy making videos. In any case, I'm still grateful for the viewers and subscribers that help to keep this channel going, and to celebrate, it's time for another Q&A response video. I've done my best to answer as many questions as possible, and apologise in advance if I don't get to your question. To keep things down to a manageable level, I took in no more than 3 questions per person. I should also mention that this video may contain swearing. Do you watch Sam's Trains for model train videos? Yes, I do watch Sam's Trains every now and then. Unless he's making a Train Sim World video, he does a decent job with being balanced in his opinions, and to an extent, I still find it amusing when he rips into a Hellion model, such as the GWR 1361 class, or for a more recent example, the Ruston and Hornsby 165DE. I'm not sure about continuing to watch his videos long term because I swear that, sometimes, he sounds like he doesn't know what he's talking about. For a recent example, I refer you to the introduction on his Bachmann Rebecca video. What's the most common Train Simulator / Train Sim World DLC pack that is overrated? Honestly, I don't think I'm in any position to determine which specific add-on is absolutely the most overrated, but even trying to think of any add-ons that I consider worthy of that adjective is a bit difficult. To an extent, I think the gameplay packs in Train Sim World are overrated, since people still buy them even though they present poor value for money and include barely anything new. In other words, they often come across as lazy cash grabs, especially in the case of Rivet Games' Arosa Aggregates and Engineering Express packs. There's numerous gameplay packs that I haven't bothered acquiring because I have no interest in them, such as the entire Cargo Line series and the most recent ones Dovetail released for the core TSW5 routes. Favourite and least favourite train couplings / couplers? I don't usually pay attention to couplers, but if I had to pick a favourite, it would probably be the old Norwegian coupling, otherwise known as chopper, that used to be commonplace here in New Zealand. Essentially, the chopper is a single buffer with a hook that drops down into the opposing central buffer. You can see chopper couplers on heritage rolling stock, but most, if not all, of the KiwiRail stock uses more modern couplers these days. As for the electric multiple units in Auckland and Wellington, they certainly don't use chopper couplers, and they don't even use knuckle couplers. Instead, I'm pretty sure they both use Scharfenberg couplers. Favourite type of American freight loco? My favourite is probably the EMD SD40-2, although I don't blame you if that comes across as a cop-out answer. Other US freight engines that I like include, but are not limited to, Norfolk Shitshow's AC44C6M, the General Electric Evolution series, or GEVO for short, and the EMD DD40AX. It's a pity that the train simulator version of this Centennial, as modelled by DTM, is a bit mediocre. Just thinking back to the AC44C6M for a moment, I like most of the special interest liveries that these things have carried, except for that rather on-the-nose PR stunt livery carried by locomotive number 4822. Opinion on the DM class engines? I assume you mean KiwiRail's new Stadler-built locomotives, and not the English Electric multiple units that used to run in Wellington. In which case, I think the DMs are fascinating locomotives. For one thing, their appearance is certainly a radical departure from what I'm used to. I initially thought they were ugly, but my opinion has since changed to go in a more neutral direction. Do you have a favourite railway network in Australia? I've always been interested in the 3-foot 6-inch gauge network in Tasmania, not just because DC 4588 went there in 1998, and I also like the Golflander up in Queensland, which happens to be another 3-foot 6-inch gauge line. But my favourite Aussie system is easily the electrified suburban network in Melbourne. Incidentally, in more recent times, I've been doing some research on the suburban network in Adelaide, and I'd love to go there at some point too. I like the look of the 3000/3100 class diesel rail cars, but the same cannot be said for the 4000 class EMUs. Those things are, in my opinion, an ugly hybrid of the Transperth B series and V-Line Velocity. In any case, I can't show any footage of the Tasrail, Golflander and Adelaide systems because I haven't been to any of them yet, and I didn't want to use other people's footage for the sake of avoiding copyright issues. Do you think Northland will ever get passenger rail services? Considering the fact that the North Auckland line is still only getting one train a day in each direction, despite all the effort KiwiRail put into rebuilding the line after bad weather in early 2023, I don't have much hope that the line will ever see passenger services beyond Swanson again. I bring up Swanson in particular because that is the terminus of the electric suburban service from Auckland's Britomart station, branded as the Western Line. It would certainly be nice to hop on a train at Auckland Strand Station and go all the way out to Whangarei. However, if such a service were to come in, I could imagine it only being marketed towards tourists instead of just being a public transport service. In other words, I imagine it being less like Te Huia and more like the Northern Explorer. Do you have a preferred type of attraction for passenger services? I'd say electric multiple units or normal coaches hauled by electric locomotives, with one reason being the environmental benefits of railway electrification. I also think New Zealand should get more of its network electrified, starting with the East Coast main trunk from Hamilton to Tauranga, as well as the 2 gaps on the North Island main trunk. The gaps in question are between Waikanae and Palmerston North, and between Hamilton and Pukekohe, although the trouble with the idea of a fully electrified NIMT is the Wellington network still using 1700 volts DC, while the other electrified sections of the NIMT use 25 kilovolts AC. You'd have to get around that somehow. Favourite US locomotive you've discussed? If you're just referring to my old Obscure Offerings mini-documentaries, then my favourite out of that lot is either the EMC AB6 or Morrison Knudsen F40 PHL-2. I can't think of any US diesels that I've discussed as train simulator reviews that I would consider to be my favourite. Favourite Clyde model with a 645? I know what you mean by that question, but I'm not sure how to answer it. I would have said the V-Line N-Class, since I'm pretty sure they were built by Clyde Engineering, but I don't know too much about them, and the only time I've ever seen any of the Ns up close was back in June 2024. I would have initially said that the New Zealand Railways DA class would be another potential favourite, although only 10 of them were actually built by Clyde Engineering, and I didn't realise until I was recording this voiceover that the DAs actually have 567 series prime movers, not 645. Incidentally, DA 1431 is the only example from that Australian-built batch to survive into preservation. All the other DAs were built in Canada. And thinking back to the N-Class, I was lucky to record N461 putting on quite a show as she left Southern Cross with a train to Swan Hill. This was back on the evening of Sunday the 23rd of June 2024, and as she left the station, I noticed that N461 sounded exactly like a KiwiRail DFB. What are your favourite EMD and GE locomotives? Those were initially separate questions, but I've combined them into one for the sake of simplicity. My favourite GE product is easily the U26C, known to New Zealanders as the DX class. 49 examples of this class were built, but one was written off and scrapped in 1977 due to accident damage, and the surviving Kiwi U-boats have all been heavily modified throughout their lives, to the point where none of them are still in the base DX classification. As for a favourite EMD locomotive, if we're just going on those that ran in the USA, then it's either the SD40-2, F40PH, or F7A. Massive cop-outs, I know. What are your thoughts on the F59 PHR in Train Sim World 5? I haven't got the F59 yet, since I don't have much interest in the two Metrolink routes, especially the Antelope Valley line. I'm waiting until the F59 gets a discount before picking her up for myself, but all I'll say about her for now is that I'm happy to see that she's in TSW at last. It's a pity that she wasn't included with the Antelope Valley or San Bernardino lines right out of the gate. How long do you think it will take to extend the overhead lines to Hamilton, and bring a passenger service to Tauranga? Originally, there were separate questions for electrification past Hamilton and passenger services to Tauranga, but I've combined them into one because they were very similar to each other. In both cases, I have absolutely no idea how long it would take since I don't work in the rail industry. It's been over 23 years since the last regular passenger trains ran in my city, and as much as I would like to see them make their long overdue return, I honestly don't expect that to ever happen because, for some reason, railway proposals in New Zealand always seem to be bogged down by excessive amounts of political squabbling and red tape, which are almost impossible to break through. As for extending electrification past Hamilton, and linking up with the Auckland suburban network, I would have initially said that that's a no-brainer, but I don't know how well it would work because the central NIMT and Auckland suburban systems are not compatible with each other. Indeed, on the rare occasions when an EF electric locomotive has had to go to Westfield Yard for a turn on the wheel lathe, she has to be towed dead behind a diesel locomotive. If, by some miracle, the powers that be actually got their shit together and started running a regular passenger train to Tauranga again, I would want new stations to be built in Omokoroa, downtown Tauranga, Bayfair, for the nearby shopping centre, and Mount Maunganui. Years ago, my dad thought that the old fire station up the top end of Totara Street could be repurposed as a railway station. Come to think of it, a station at that location could also be set up as an interchange with the Bayhopper bus network, since Route 5 runs along Totara Street. For reference, the 5 runs from downtown Tauranga to Bayfair via Mount Maunganui, with 15-minute headways on weekdays and 30-minute headways on weekends. Is there a piece of DLC for TS Classic and TSW you wanted to cover but haven't yet or didn't want to? Yes, there's lots of TS add-ons that I want to cover, but haven't got to yet for one reason or another. One random example is the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway L-Class. As for TSW, I've already covered the vast majority of add-ons that I own in that game, but even then, there's still a few that I don't want to review, such as Cajon Pass and Kassel to Würzburg. I'm not sure about whether or not I'll continue reviewing TSW add-ons long term, since the game is an absolute mess at this point. Would you consider having guests for certain reviews? Honestly, I haven't really thought of that before. The last time I remember having a guest on this channel was when I did the races with Dark DJ, but those videos were certainly not normal reviews. I'm not sure who I'd want to collaborate with for a review, and in any case, I'd more than likely be too nervous to contact anyone and ask if they wanted to be part of a review. My fear of rejection doesn't just apply to potentially asking a woman out on a date. Do you like the song Heaven is a Place on Earth, sung by Belinda Carlisle? Well, I can safely say I wasn't expecting to get any music-related questions. But regardless, I have mixed thoughts on Heaven is a Place on Earth. While the actual music itself is pretty good, I think the lyrics are way too sappy for my liking. I don't know enough songs from Belinda Carlisle to have a solid opinion on her as an artist, but incidentally, there's one from the Go-Go's that I kind of like, and that's the extended version of Our Lips Are Sealed. Despite it being well before my time, the 1980s is my favourite era for music, and as for how I found out about Belinda Carlisle in the first place, it's because I heard her song Circle in the Sand on a radio station in Grand Theft Auto 5. And one last thing about 1980s music. I recently discovered the extended version of Over My Head by Tony Basil, and I couldn't recommend that song enough. It is a fucking banger! Would you go to Palmerston North and ride the new CRRC buses? I would certainly like to go back to Palmerston North at some point. It'd be fairly easy to get there since it's a calling point on the Tauranga to Wellington intercity bus route, but if I do go, I would mainly observe the rail activity again. Although the trouble with the railway in Palmerston North is that it's only around the northern and eastern edges of the city, and it would be difficult to get around to the different vantage points without a car. Incidentally, I've only got one photograph of a CRRC electric bus in Palmerston North, taken in April 2024. If the ones in Palmerston North are anything like their counterparts on the CityLink service in Auckland, I would be a bit wary of them. For context, the CityLink buses have absolutely awful seats, just about the worst I've ever experienced on a bus. They are of an uncomfortable shape with sod all padding. The only upside is that the CityLink is a very short route, and indeed, I've only ever used it as a shuttle to get from the foot of Queen Street to Wynyard Quarter and back. On the subject of electric buses, and where they actually get their electricity from, I prefer trolley buses over battery buses, because trolleys don't have to lug around the weight of all those heavy batteries. Incidentally, I once spoke to a driver here in Tauranga who told me that our electric buses weigh 17 tonnes, and 7 of those tonnes are just batteries. Make of that what you will. Would you go train spotting in the Levin/Horowhenua area? I have filmed a few trains in Levin, most recently in October 2022, if I recall correctly. But I'm not sure if I would ever do a dedicated trip just for rail fanning in that area. I'd probably only film trains in Levin if I was just passing through on my way to Wellington. Indeed, That's exactly what I was doing one night in July 2020. And incidentally, I've always found the tiny pack and save in Levin to be a bit amusing. Would you still buy the London Overground North London line in TSW 5 if you wanted to? Firstly, I still refer to the Stratford to Richmond route as the North London line because I refuse to address any of the London Overground lines by their new names. As for whether or not I'd buy the route, I really don't know. While it looks like it's got lots of rail activity and well-detailed scenery, cutting the route coverage at Willesden Junction instead of going all the way to Richmond still doesn't sit right with me. What's your favourite British steam locomotive? That's currently a tie between the London and North Eastern Railway A3 and Great Western Railway 7200 classes. It's a shame that only one A3 is preserved, and that none of the surviving 7200s have steamed in preservation yet. What's your favourite food/snack? At the time of uploading, my favourite is a tie between sushi and ice cream, but that is subject to change. If you had the opportunity to save 2 NZ locomotives, one steam and one diesel, that were scrapped or sent overseas, what locomotives would they be? If I could save any Kiwi engines that were sent overseas, I would go for DFT 7008 and DC 4588, hands down. As for any scrapped classes, I would go for E66, that strange one-off Malay tank engine, one of the Q-class Pacifics, it's an absolute fucking crime that none of them were saved, or WJ466, the big Baldwin-built 284 tank from the Wellington and Manawatu Railway Company. What DFB and DX locomotives do you predict will go into preservation when KiwiRail eventually phases them out? With all due respect, I don't see much point in making any specific predictions given just how unpredictable the railway world is, but I do hope that at least one example of each of the DFB and DX classes is preserved. As for any specific DXs I hope can be saved, I would have said 5143 and 5293 if KiwiRail hadn't spoiled them with the Phase 2 repaint, so my alternative picks are DXB 5137, DXC 5391, and DXR 8022. Meanwhile, there's one DFB above all others that I hope to see preserved, and that's DFB 7064. If you could own an NZ Heritage Railway, where would it be based and what locomotives would be there? I think I would go for the disused branch line from Hawkins Junction to Tane Atua in the Bay of Plenty, which has been out of action for well over 20 years now, not counting the bizarre golf cart operations out of Awakeri. As for any specific locomotives I'd have on my own heritage line, I would just try to go for a very simple fleet, similar to what they've got in Gisborne. The one steam locomotive would be WAB 800, while a mainline diesel would be DC 4444, as a backup for the WAB on passenger trains. And I would also have DSJ 4060 just for shunting. Are you going to buy the Tadami line for Train Sim World when that comes out? Yes, I would certainly like to get the Tadami line, even if only because it'll be a long overdue break from the overabundance of standard gauge routes. But I don't know too much about the real line, and Japanese railways in general, so I wouldn't do too good of a job determining if the in-game route is good/accurate or not. What are your thoughts on the DM's horn? So far, I've only heard it once, on that day when I was lucky to see DM8012 out on a test run. The driver only blasted the horn for a split second, but even then, it reminded me of the V-Line Sprinter railcars. If you were able to chase a train by yourself, what lines would you do and what island would you rather do so in? If and when I ever get my driver's license, I'd probably start off simple by chasing a train on the Goldfields Railway from Waihi to Waikino, or the DC locomotives running the M52 shunt on the Waitoa branch. Obviously, I'm less familiar with the South Island network, but I dare say it wouldn't be too hard to chase a train from Templeton to Ashburton or Timaru. Or hell, you could be a bit more daring and go all the way to Dunedin. As for the location where this footage was recorded, it's Templeton in March 2025. What are your 3 favourite mainline running locomotives, be they steam or diesel, and 3 that run on heritage railways? To my knowledge, there aren't many mainline certified heritage locomotives actually running on the KiwiRail system, so I can't really pick as many as 3 favourites, but 2 of them that I do like are JA1271 and DC4818. As for any favourites that are just confined to heritage lines, one of them is DBR1199 on the Goldfields Railway, and another is probably F180 on the Western Springs Railway. Which Train Simulator Classic third-party DLC do you prefer? If we're just sticking with the British scene, then Caledonia Works and Victory Works are perhaps my favourite third-party developers, but I also like products from Mesh Tools and Fourths Games, amongst other developers whose names I can't remember off the top of my head. By contrast, I'm less knowledgeable on which developers make American add-ons, but I can tell you that Digital Train Model is one to avoid, especially if his depiction of the Alco DL109 is anything to go by. Do you have any interest in Italian railways? Not really, to be honest, but it's nothing personal against the people of Italy. Aside from a tiny bit about the old line from Rimini to San Marino, I don't know anything about Italian railways. How can one support you and your work? Only through the super thanks thingy on YouTube, if I ever get around to enabling that. I haven't set up a Patreon page because I don't think I could offer any good rewards, and I wouldn't want people to get the impression that they're expected to donate money. If I ever do enable super thanks, I would just treat it as a tip jar, but I certainly wouldn't force the idea of donating down people's gobs. Why do you have such a good interest in British trains? When I was a kid, I remember my parents getting me this random book that was full of colour photographs of 1980s-era British locomotives. I remember being intrigued by the colours and general appearances of said locomotives. and have since found out what all of those classes in the book are. I seem to recall that one of those types was the Class 20, albeit not in the rail freight livery. The main causes of my interest in British trains were the aforementioned book, and, of course, Thomas the Tank Engine. If you could go back to a certain time period in the railways, which and why? Even though I've seen the first Back to the Future film, I don't like the idea of time travel, but regardless, I'd probably go back to the 1960s into South Island. That was near the tail end of regular steam operations on NZR, and also when the Christchurch to Lyttelton line was still electrified. An alternative time period to go back to would be around 1975, when you would still see DI-class diesel locomotives in Wei He, as in those days, what we now know as the Goldfields Railway was still part of the East Coast Main Trunk. If there is anything you can change about TS Classic or Train Sim World, which and why? For starters, I would get Dovetail Games to significantly reduce their release frequency for DLC, lower the prices to a less borderline insulting level, and to try to find third-party developers based in the USA, Australia, and New Zealand, so that way we could hopefully get more American routes and finally get some from the lands down under. For an Aussie route, I would like to see the Grange line in Adelaide or the Mernda line in Melbourne. I suggest the Mernda line despite the fact that I've only been as far as Keon Park, instead of going all the way to the terminus. As for any ideas for a New Zealand TSW route, one of many that comes to mind is the branch line from Huntly to Glen Afton as it was in the 1950s. What is your favourite Train Sim World mod from the Train Sim community? Oh, that's an easy answer. The Islands Line 2022 Enhancement Pack, because it makes some important improvements to my favourite route in the game, with the main one being replacing the Class 484's ugly default livery for what these units actually carry in real life. I would have said the WCML Enhancement Pack was another favourite, but I don't play on the London to Milton Keynes route all that much. One thing that puts me off from doing so is a rather annoying issue where the Class 350s move with their pantographs down. The Class 390 is not affected by this issue, so I have no idea what's going on, and I certainly don't know how to fix it. What train simulator routes would you like to see in TSW? The first one that came to mind was München to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, but other TS routes that I wouldn't mind seeing in TSW are East Coast Main Line London to Peterborough, New York to New Haven, complete with Grand Central plus the New Cannon, Danbury and Waterbury branches, the Frankfurt U-Bahn, and Pacific Surfliner Los Angeles to San Diego. If they were to be remade, I wouldn't want any sections cut off, especially where the Frankfurt U-Bahn and ECML London to Peterborough are concerned. It would also be a good opportunity to add the Hertford Loop, which was on the TS version, just without scenery for some reason. And of course, they could also add the branch line from Finsbury Park to Moorgate. What is your favourite British train? I take that to specifically mean multiple units, since locomotives are not trains. It's hard for me to pick a favourite, since there are so many that I like, but I think I could narrow the choices down to the Class 506, Class 487, Class 755, Class 504, Class 150, and, maybe somewhat controversially, the Hitachi IET family. What gave you the idea to start reviewing Train Sim World and Train Sim Classic content? I've had several influences over the years, including Maverick Hunter Daniel, Yowie, and Dark DJ Productions, although DDJP isn't as much of a reviewer as the other two. Incidentally, MHD was one of the biggest influences for me because of his brutal honesty, and I also liked his comedic editing. Even some YouTubers who don't talk about railway stuff at all, such as Sydney Watson, have still been influential to me. I bring her up in particular because A. I'm interested in what she has to say, B. She's independent with fairly grounded takes, in other words, she tells it like it is, and C. Unlike me, she has the guts to show her face in videos. As for why I'm showing photographs of specific rebuilt ex-British Rail Mark II coaches, it's because their classification happens to be the same as Sydney's initials. What are your thoughts on the North London line after Dovetail's livestream? I didn't watch the livestream, and indeed, I don't bother watching any of Dovetail's livestreams, so I don't have any more thoughts on the North London line. As I said earlier, I'm now undecided on whether or not I'll ever buy the route in TSW. If I ever do, I'll wait until I can get it at a discount because $43.59 NZD is way too high a price for such a short route. Which UK freight train is your favourite? As I said in reply to a previous question, I take train to mean multiple units, in this case. As such, I think my favourite UK freight train is the Class 325, especially since I can't think of any other multiple units that were purpose-built for freight instead of passengers. If you meant a UK freight locomotive, then I was initially going to answer with the Class 37, until I remembered that she's more of an all-rounder than purely a freight hauler. I think the Class 70 would have to be my favourite UK freight locomotive, as strange of a choice as that may be. Have you ever been to another country like the UK? At the time of this video's production, the only other country I've been to is Australia, but that will change later this year. What got you into YouTube and train spotting? Regarding how I got into watching trains, I think one of my main influences was a documentary series I watched years ago. It was presented by a guy called Marcus Lush and named Off the Rails. More recently, I saw other people making railway videos and thought I could try that myself. And after I got the confidence to start adding voiceovers to my videos, I had the idea to start reviewing Train Simulator and Train Sim World content, and the rest, as they say, is history. Although I was already a rail fan long before I discovered Francis Bourgeois, his videos remind me to not be embarrassed about being a rail fan, but I don't blame you if you think he's an acquired taste. I don't expect to meet him when I'm in England, but one can still hope. Although my channel is monetized, I'm not into this YouTube game just for the money, and, by extension, attention. If you had the money and time, would you come to the UK and film trains there? We see it all the time in your train sim reviews, and so it would be nice to see them in person rather than just via a computer. And it's funny you ask that question, because I will be going to England and Wales within the next month. I don't want to say exactly where I'll be going and on what days. All I'll say is that I'll just be visiting a few heritage lines and trying to film as many trains as I can on the main line. However, I will leave you with a few clues of what I'm intending to see, namely a little rail car in the Midlands, a world-famous narrow gauge line, and modern EMUs on a ridiculously frequent service underneath London. I don't expect to meet any other rail fans, especially ones as famous as Jeff Marshall and the previously mentioned Francis Bourgeois, but I'll just take the road as it comes. That idea of taking the road as it comes always reminds me of the Dire Straits song News. Do you have other hobbies besides trains? I'm also interested in buses and aircraft, but not much else outside the transport world. I do a bit of gardening on extremely rare occasions, and of course there's the pets to take care of. Sometimes I also like to photograph flowers and birds. In this case, I think it was a grey heron. Thinking back to the buses, what we've got in Tauranga is decent, I guess? And I do like the Enviro 200s, but the network still leaves an awful lot to be desired. Don't get me started on the state of the city centre interchange, the lack of a dedicated bus service to the airport, and some routes, like the 1, 62 and 72, still only running every 30 minutes on weekdays, when they used to be every 20 minutes. What is your opinion on the current state of Train Sim World, and do you think it needs a good competitor? Even though I would probably stick with TSW anyway, I think that they should get a good competitor to light a fire under Dovetail's bottom. But since I've been doing so many TS Classic videos lately, I haven't really had much time to catch up on what's been going on with TSW. As for what I think of its current state, all I'll say is that I'm ashamed of Dovetail and how they still press on with their questionable business practices. The sad thing is that I don't see their virtual monopoly changing unless a really strong competitor comes along, but that's probably quite unlikely. Do you have any favourite mainline steam locomotives? Since you put capital letters on mainline and steam, I'm guessing you specifically mean locomotives from the Mainline Steam Trust. In which case, my favourite is a tie between JA1275 and KA942, despite not liking the KA's ugly boxy streamlining at all. Do you have any NZ Rail Scene DVDs or VHS tapes? Yes, I've still got a few Rail Scene DVDs, and I think I've also got Volume 9 on VHS, which I inherited from Grandad after he passed away. Incidentally, I once met the man who did the voiceovers for the Rail Scene programs. Lindsay Benbrook himself was in attendance at Mount Maunganui back in October 2013, when KiwiRail's Exhibition Express was in town. That was something they did to celebrate 150 years of railways in New Zealand, and it's very disappointing that they haven't bothered doing any kind of similarly elaborate exhibition since 2013. Should we have more KiwiRail liveries? I wouldn't necessarily say we need more variants. I just think that more locomotives should have got the early Phase 1 livery than just the 7 who actually did. You would have always been lucky to see Phase 1 out in the wild, and these days, only 2 locomotives are still running while painted in that livery, namely DC 4260 and DXB 5137. Favourite pre-grouping organisation? I'd say the London and South Western Railway, but the irony is that I don't know too much about them. I just like how their locomotives looked, and have ended up with a large collection of LSWR locomotives in TS Classic. My favourite from that selection is either the T9 class 440, 700 class 060, or T14 Class 460. Incidentally, all three of these classes were designed by Dugald Drummond and modelled for Train Simulator by Caledonia Works. What would you do if you were the manager at KiwiRail? Honestly, I don't even want to think about what I would do if I was top brass, simply because I'm not cut out for such a big and important job. If I was to ever work with KiwiRail, it would ideally just be as a driver. Favourite Australian locomotives / multiple units? My favourite Australian locomotive is easily the Pacific National NR class. Has been for a long time, but it wasn't until June 2024 when I could finally see an NR in person. As for a favourite multiple unit from across the ditch, my money's on the Comenge EMUs in Melbourne. I like their traction motor sound and how they have two distinctly different early 2000s refurbishment styles. I prefer the EDI Comenge over the Alstom Comenge myself. Meanwhile, my second favourite Aussie EMU is probably the refurbished Harris, another one from the Melbourne suburban network. What are your thoughts on the XPT? Do you think they look better or worse than the HST? I'll start off by saying that the XPT is the nearest thing to an HST that I've seen in person so far. As for their appearance, I honestly think they look worse than their British counterparts, but other than that, I don't have much of an opinion on them because I couldn't go for a ride when I was in Melbourne. I only saw them arriving at Southern Cross or passing North Melbourne and Middle Footscray, and if, by some miracle, I could go to Sydney before the CAF Civity units take over, I'd try to at least see the XPT again. What is your least favourite high-speed train set / EMU? That's a tie between Amtrak's Avalia Liberty thing and the rolling stock used on Brightline in Florida. The Venture coaches are a vibe, but what really spoils the overall consist's appearance is the SCB-40 Charger locomotive, with her ugly streamlined cab front. In lieu of any Brightline footage, I've had to use footage from the Miami to West Palm Beach route in TS Classic. What other games do you play outside of the train-related games? The only ones I've played in recent memory are Minecraft and Grand Theft Auto 5, although I've since lost interest in playing the latter, especially since the online mode was, and for all I know probably still is, a fucking shit show. I'm not really interested in the more mainstream or AAA games. Indeed, I have never played a single Mario or Sonic game in my life, and I have no intention of ever doing so. What new features would you add to TS Classic? More than anything else, I'd want to see the optimization improved for both TS Classic and TSW. I can't think of any entirely new features I would want to see in the older game, since, aside from occasional crashing, the game is fine as it is. What is your favourite model locomotive?
And he's got a cowboy seat on one side and don't hook on the other side.
Out of the ones in my current collection, that's hard to say because there are so many of them. A short list of candidates would include, but probably wouldn't be limited to, the HS4000 Kestrel from Hellion, Pacific National NR107 from Oxygen, LNER W1 Hush Hush from Hornby, and the Class 03 Diesel Shunter in Network Southeast colours from Bachmann Branchline. What top 3 locomotives are you most wanting to be restored? Now, I don't mean to sound harsh, but the wording of that question could have been better. As for some locomotives that I want to see restored, I'll just stick with choices from New Zealand for the sake of simplicity. In which case, my money's on F185, Pickett 042 tank number 1957, and a standard railcar RM32, although all three are extremely unlikely. The RM has been hidden away in a shed at the Glenbrook Vintage Railway for many years now, so I've had to use shots from her classmate's RM31 as a substitute. As for the little Pickett 042 tank, she would require a whole new boiler, and the Goldfields Railway crew have told me that it would cost well into the 6 figures to get this locomotive running again. Their trains are always diesel-hauled, so even if the Society did have the money to overhaul the Pickett, it would take a fair while to get any of their drivers trained on a steam locomotive. As for F185, she's preserved on the Glen Afton branch west of Huntly, but hasn't run under her own power for over 20 years. This locomotive has been hidden away in the shed for ages at this point, and like the Pickett in Wei He, would require a whole new boiler in order to run again. I brought up 185 in the first place just because the F-Class 060 saddle tank has long been one of my favourite steam locomotives, but they don't hold a candle to the JA class. If any developer from TSW announced another UK heritage railway was being developed, which one would you like and why? There's a lot to choose from, but I think I can narrow down my picks to just the Talyllyn and Severn Valley railways. But to be honest, I wouldn't have high hopes if another heritage route was announced for TSW, given how badly Dovetail has botched steam locomotives in the game. What other US steam locomotives would you like in TSW aside from the Southern Pacific AC-12 cab forward? Ideally the Pennsylvania Railroad S1 and Union Pacific 412-2. But since they are both ridiculously large locomotives, I'd rather see the developers start off with something a lot more simple, such as the Denver and Rio Grande Western K37 class. As far as I know, the nearest thing we've got to a K37 in either TS Classic or TSW is the K27, which comes with the Rio Grande Southern route by Milepost Simulations. I want to review this route at some point, but I have no idea when I'll get around to it. Who is your favourite TSC/TSW third-party developer? My favourite for TS Classic is probably Caledonia Works, while either Just Trains or TrainSim Germany are my favourites for TSW. The high quality of the Niedertalbahn, Blackpool branches, and WCML Preston to Carlisle puts a lot of dovetail and rivet routes to shame. What is your favourite Desiro and British diesel loco? Favourite British diesel is easily the Class 37, not just for her iconic prime mover sound, but also the long and varied history of this class. and the sheer amount of detail variation across the class as well. As for a favourite Desiro, that honour goes to the Class 360 because of her lack of a cab-end gangway, which results in her looking distinctly different from the Class 350 and other older UK Desiros. I'm hoping to film some 360s in real life when I go to England, and yes, I'm aware of them now running on the Midland Main Line. Can you explain the New Zealand signalling system? Sorry, but I don't think I can. I barely know anything about it apart from the most basic stuff. I remember hearing about how the Auckland suburban network uses ETCS these days, but I have no idea how that works. I think I'm a bit more knowledgeable on semaphore signals, but of course they're not used on the national network anymore. What do you think is the main thing holding TSW back from its full potential? There's a lot of things holding this game back, but I think the main one is Dovetail Games seemingly stubbornly refusing to change their business practices for the better. We're still getting routes that are way too short or have questionable start and end points, not to mention rather bland/uninspired concepts in several cases, as well as DLC that's often way too expensive for what you get. Not to mention rushed through development, and don't even get me started on the ridiculous annual releases. One wonders if this nonsense will ever change for the better. If you could ride on any UK railway line, what would it be? I'd have to say either the Borderlands line, from Wrexham Central to Bidston, or the Islands line, from Ryde Pierhead to Shanklin. I say that mainly because of my interest in the unusual London Underground D78 stock rebuilds running on both lines, and the differences between the Class 230 and Class 484 are just fascinating to me, as is the very concept of rebuilding old tube stock for mainline service. Incidentally, the 484 is probably more conventional than the 230, but still presents an unusual sight given how much the Isle of Wight differs from London. How would you improve LGV Mediterranee? By extending the route coverage to Lyon, or at the very least Valence, for one thing. I'd also upgrade the scenery to Niedertalbahn standards and add at least one more train, since it's just annoying to only have one motive power option for the route. Unfortunately, the situation with just one train, and consequently a very boring rail scene, doesn't just apply to Marseille to Avignon. When will we ever get a passenger train service between Auckland and Wellington? Actually, there's already a service running over the full North Island main trunk. It's called the Northern Explorer, but the problem is that it is so specifically optimised just for tourists that it's pretty much useless as a regular public transport service. The same issue applies to the Transalpine and Coastal Pacific in the South Island, and thinking back to the Northern Explorer, I still intended to make a video where I discuss the service in detail, but I don't know when that will be published. If you could have any US TSW routes, what would be the top 3 that you would add to the game? First one is the WeGo Star from Nashville to Lebanon in Tennessee. The second is Coaster from San Diego to Oceanside in California, and the third is the full Metra Electric District network in Illinois. If the Coaster route came to the game, I imagine it would be set in more modern times, with Siemens SC44 Chargers running the show instead of the old EMD F59 PHI and Morrison Knudsen F40 PH-2C locomotives. Do you have any interest in the classic French railway? In other words, any non-high-speed lines, without counting lines A and C of the Lyon Metro? I don't know much about the classic SNCF network, but something I do remember from it is the 242A1 steam locomotive. I've always found this thing quite fascinating, and it's a shame that she wasn't preserved. Incidentally, I wouldn't mind seeing another French route made for TSW, regardless of whether it's the Lyon Metro or a conventional SNCF line. Do you own a copy of the LGV Méditerranée Marseille to Lyon in TS Classic? I initially thought you just meant the original Marseille to Avignon route, and it took me a while to realise that I hadn't read the question properly. Regarding the extended route to Lyon, I haven't got it yet, but I see that it's still available on Steam, although that begs the question as to why the TGV Réseau pack was discontinued. In any case, I'm not all that interested in the default TGV duplex. The TSW version is much better, and a couple of TGV variants that I'd like to see in either TS Classic or TSW are the Sud-Est and La Poste. Do you prefer AC or DC? Or perhaps AC-DC? Unintended pun, I swear. We do have both types of current in France, and this is a debate that can lead to severe arguments whether you're north or south based. I know that alternating current is the preferred choice for modern electrification schemes, but I don't prefer it over direct current, or vice versa. I've noticed that a system's use of DC is a direct giveaway to its age. Case in point, the suburban network in Melbourne, where electric trains started running in 1919. By contrast, the Auckland network wasn't electrified until 2014, so that uses 25 kV AC. Could NZ get a high-speed rail service between Auckland and Wellington? If yes, which cities or towns should it serve along the way? Personally, I don't think my country could ever get a high-speed railway on par with the French or German systems. Our population is just too small to justify such a massive project. If the North Island and South Island were to be connected via a tunnel or bridge, could we see inter-island rail? I think the distance between the North and South Islands would be far too long for a bridge, but even a tunnel would probably be too impractical. If it were to be built anyway, I think incorporating a railway, instead of just doing a road or tunnel, would be an absolutely essential feature. That would also go if they were going to try and build a tunnel under the Waitemata Harbour in Auckland. What is your top 10 most and least favourite locomotive/EMU/subway units from the US and UK? On the American scene at least, I don't think I'd have enough for a top or bottom 10 in all three categories. And although it's hard to determine a top or bottom 10 since I haven't been to the US yet, there are some EMUs from both mainline and subway networks that I still like. Those units include the New Jersey Transit Arrow 3, Long Island Railroad M7 and M9, Staten Island R44 subway stock, and Metra Highliner 2, while the only unit I know I don't like is the Caltrain Stadler Kiss. As for any locomotives, well, for a start, you can't go wrong with the good old Pennsylvania Railroad GG1. It's a pity this model in TS Classic is so old and basic. Although this is an electro-diesel rather than purely electric, I still consider the New Jersey Transit ALP 45DP as one of my favourites from the American scene. What are your three favourite, middle-of-the-road, and rock-bottom US routes in TSW? Upon reading the words middle of the road, I immediately thought of that song by The Pretenders. Anyway, my favourite US route is probably Boston Sprinter, and a middle-of-the-road route is the Metro North Harlem line, although the Harlem line still has a few issues. As for an American route I'd consider to be rock bottom, I would have said Cane Creek, but A, that's a cop-out, and B, I haven't got it. Going off the US routes that I've actually got, I can't think of any that are absolutely rock bottom, but I will say that I find the Antelope Valley and San Bernardino lines to be the most boring US routes in my collection. What is your favourite German electric loco? I don't think I know enough about German electrics as a whole to pick a favourite, but one that I like regardless of my ignorance is the BR193 Vectron for her versatility and a distinctive appearance. Incidentally, I can play a few different musical riffs on the locomotive's horn. See if you can recognise this one. And here's another one that might be easier for the younger generations to recognise. When and why did you start YouTube? I've already explained why I started my channel in reply to a previous question. As for when the channel started, it was actually early 2015, but it wasn't until 2019 when I really got stuck into the grind. After all this time, it's probably still Train Simulator Classic. Train Sim World would have blasted it out of the water, but for several reasons, like the ones I described earlier, the newer game is still held back from reaching its full potential to a frustrating degree. And I don't think TSW will ever have anywhere near as much content for it as Train Simulator currently has. So the older game does still have a purpose. Do you genuinely hate DLs? No, I don't hate them at all. At this point I'm just bored of them. But I do still have a couple of favourites from the class, namely 9008 and 9400, while the least favourites are, without a doubt, 9688 and 9740. I bring those two up despite not being comfortable with explaining why they're my least favourite DLs. For context, this next question relates to the pedestrian crossings in New Plymouth, which have seen significant upgrades in the last 4 years despite the line's criminal underutilisation. Had you ever seen the ground-mounted lights and voice message boxes working at those level crossings at any point? Honestly, I didn't even know there were voice boxes at the crossings by the Windwand, let alone anywhere in New Zealand. Not sure what to make of the idea in any case. As for the lights on the ground, I did notice them last time I was in New Plymouth, but didn't see them in action as my vantage points for filming DL 9423 was further away from the crossings. The lights could certainly be useful at more crossings, especially if and when people are looking down at their phones as they're walking along. On the subject of unusual crossings, I always thought the most unusual one in the country was this one just north of Kandala Station on the Johnsonville line. I was disappointed to find out that, in the time since I took these photographs in May 2022, the iconic Dutch E-bells have been replaced by stock standard W.C. Hayes E-bells. But I did manage to get some audio of these older bells when they were still there. If you controlled the New Zealand Railways, what would you change/adjust? For one thing, I would fight tooth and nail to try and restore regional passenger services on as many routes as possible, such as Wellington to Napier, Christchurch to Invercargill, and Hamilton to Tauranga. Currently, Te Huia is the only locomotive-hauled passenger train, outside of the Wellington area, that's just run as a public transport service instead of being marketed solely towards tourists. Te Huia is a fairly recent startup that runs from Hamilton's Frankton Station to Auckland Strand. It launched in April 2021 after multiple delays, and I think the concept is really good, but the execution could have been an awful lot better. They should have picked a better name for a start. Have you ever played Cities Skylines before? If not, would you ever consider trying it out for a future video? Yes, I have played Cities Skylines, but not for over a year at this point, and I don't remember when I uninstalled it. As for whether or not I'd make a video about it, I'm afraid that's highly unlikely. Since you're a fan of Dark DJ Productions and the Dark Railway series, have you also watched some of the other shows in the 77C series, namely Tales of New Wessex by Steaming Westwood Productions and Rails to Refuge by Epic Bernastard? Yes, I've seen both Tales of New Wessex and Rails to Refuge, but haven't watched the latter for a fair while at this point, and I can't remember the names of most of its characters. Honestly, I prefer TONW to RTR, but I mean no disrespect to Epic Bernastard. Thinking back to TDRS, it's worth mentioning that I had already been a fan of the show long before talking to Dark DJ himself. What are your thoughts on the Mittenwaldbahn? Assuming you mean the add-on in Train Sim World 5, then I have no opinion on it because I haven't got it yet. I'm waiting until I can get it on a discount, just like what I did for West Coast Mainline Preston to Carlisle. If you could have DTG, or any third-party dev, make any route you want, what would it be? Well, I've got a few ideas, one of which is a 2-in-1 featuring the Grange and Outer Harbour lines in Adelaide. Another one is the Ski Tube Rack Railway in New South Wales, and a third is a second 2-in-1, this time featuring lines A and C of the Lyon Metro. Of course, I also want to see New Zealand's East Coast Main Trunk made as a TSW add-on, with the route coverage going from Hamilton to Tauranga and Mount Maunganui, plus the branches to Hautapu and Waitoa. I think the total route length would be 136 kilometres, or 84.5 miles, and I would want a minimum of 3 locomotive types to be included, namely the DL class for the mainline services, the DC class for the M52 shunts to Hautapu and Waitoa, and the DSG class for shunting in Hamilton and Mount Maunganui. Would you like TSG to make more expert DLCs of content that has or hasn't been featured in the game yet? I'm not sure, since I haven't had any experience with the Expert BR101 yet. As for any locomotives I'd want them to model for TSW, regardless of whether or not they would be in Expert mode, I would want them to do the BR120 or BR156. I can only show the BR120 because, as far as I know, we haven't got the rare BR156 in TS Classic. When you are train spotting, how do you know where to wait for the trains, and how do you know what train you are filming? Regarding where I go to wait for the trains, that's determined by A, whether or not I think it's a good vantage point, and B, if it's easy to get to. It helps that numerous bus routes here in Tauranga run close to the railway line, namely routes 2, 5, 60 and 72. I've always kept notes of when the trains pass by, so I have a rough idea of what time of day I should be there if/when I go back in future. As for how I know which specific train I'm filming, that's from advice I've picked up from the New Zealand Locomotives Facebook group. I've also learned from my own experience that, when you're watching trains in Tauranga, it's easy to tell what type of service it is. If the train consists entirely of container wagons, there's a good chance it's only starting from or going as far as the port sidings at Sulphur Point. The comparative few that continue all the way to Mount Maunganui often carry logs, newsprint and steel coils. There's also the log trains that come up from Kawerau as well, but they don't go through downtown Tauranga, so I don't film them all that often. For anyone wanting to film trains here, I recommend vantage points at the Otu Moitai Gardens, Maxwell's Road Crossing, the Marsh Street Overbridge, the Strand in downtown Tauranga, Matapihi, and Mount Maunganui's Hull Road East crossing. Matapihi is quite interesting because it feels like a rural environment vaguely similar to Waimiha on the North Island main trunk, despite the presence of busy and built-up areas close by. If you could choose what kind of loco you would want in either TSW or TS Classic, what would it be? One of many ideas I've had for TSW is the FP/FT Matangi class EMU and Metlink colours, included as part of a Wellington to Waikanai route, which would be around 53 kilometres long with a good mix of urban, rural and coastal scenery. As for TS Classic, I'll go for a random and obscure example in the form of the New Zealand Railways BA Class 480, specifically the rebuilt variant with a wide firebox boiler, although I'm not sure what route would be suitable for that locomotive. If you could improve upon TSW, what changes would you make to the game overall? For one thing, I would try to sort out the piss-poor optimization. I would also reduce the frequency of DLC releases, since that would, at least in theory, give the staff more time to work on a project and make sure it's as good as it can be. I'm tired of seeing add-ons released with obvious signs of being rushed through development. Case in point, Dovetail's WCML London to Milton Keynes, and more recently, Pfälzische Ludwigsbahn, Mannheim to Kaiserslautern, but I haven't got that German route myself. For many years, especially after launching TSW, Dovetail have come across as a very greedy company. Anyone would think that they believe they can just keep on churning out half-baked crap to rake in the dosh and just fix the bugs later, if they can be bothered to fix the bugs at all. Sometimes, I wonder why I still haven't just said, fuck this, and given up on TSW. At this point in time, do you think Train Simulator Classic still holds up, and is it better than Train Sim World in most aspects of a train simulator? Yes, I think TS Classic still holds up, although you do need an awful lot of mods and enhancements just to get certain routes and trains up to a decent standard. While TSW has a more immersive experience, partly because you could get up out of your seat and walk around, I don't see it ever completely replacing its predecessor, especially since, as I've said throughout the video, DTG don't seem to have any interest in changing their questionable business practices for the better. With the trouble of DTG losing license to make things in both the trains and route, do you think going onwards they should just make everything unbranded just to get away with licensing? No, they shouldn't even consider the idea of unbranded trains. To see a train, locomotive or route without realistic branding in TSW completely spoils the immersion. I could also say the same about the Aurora to Chicago route in TS Classic, unless you've got branding patches installed for the Metra F40PH-3 and gallery coaches. What do you usually put into consideration when reviewing a train or route in Train Simulator Classic and World? One factor behind what I choose to review is whether or not I like a certain add-on, or still find it interesting enough to talk about in a video. Another is whether or not I can fully wrap my head around all the content included in a big/comprehensive pack. For example, I made a video about the LNER P1 Mikado because A, I'm interested in this class, and B, there's a smaller amount of content in that pack than, for example, the A3 Pacific. Even though there's an awful lot of variation in the A3 pack, this is one of my favourite British steam locomotives, as I said earlier, and I've got a good enough understanding of all the variation to the point where I can put this class on my list of planned reviews. Meanwhile, another locomotive I'm interested in reviewing is the previously mentioned Elco DL109. The London and South Western Railway M7 class 044 tank is another UK steamer that I like, but I can't fully wrap my head around the sheer amount of variation in this pack, so I don't think I'll review the M7 anytime soon, if at all. In any case, the Caledonia Works M7 is objectively better than Digital Train Models DL109. As for the TSW scene, there's a few add-ons in my collection that I have no interest in reviewing, and at this point, there's only a few left that I do want to review at some point, such as Main Spetautbahn and Sherman Hill. In any case, I only make videos about things I genuinely want to discuss or showcase. I don't want to pressure myself into getting a video done, especially if/when I don't have enough motivation. Do you plan to visit Canada? I do have a casual interest in Canadian railways, and would certainly like to go there at some point, but I'm afraid I won't be able to do that anytime soon. Whenever I do go there, I'll probably focus on filming Go Transit, the West Coast Express, and other passenger services due to my lack of knowledge on Canadian freight trains. It's a shame that there's only one Trainsim World route that's set in Canada, and that one route is focused solely on freight, not to mention being very short, poorly detailed, and boring. Despite the crude reused sounds, I still enjoy driving the GP9 RM that comes with this route. Would you consider a video looking at the steam locomotives in TSW and giving each one their pros and cons before ranking the 4 locos? Honestly, no. Although I can say that the Fowler 4F is my favourite of the 4 steam locomotives in TSW. The other 3 are just as disappointing as each other. I did revisit Spirit of Steam in Peak Forest in early 2024, not long after DTG quietly abandoned Steam development for the game. And if Thomas the Tank Engine is all they'll ever do for more Steam in TSW, then dear Lord help us all. play any other train games besides Trains, TSW, and TSC. Railroads Online is the only railway game outside of the norm that I've played recently. I used to play Rolling Line on a regular basis, and was a well-known rescreen creator too, even getting to meet the developer himself at one point, but I have since lost interest in his game. Personally, I think it's strayed too far away from its original New Zealand setting. What would you recommend to someone who has just started to play TS, and likes the UK steam, routes, and locomotives? To keep it simple, I'll initially stick with products you can buy on Steam. In which case, two routes that I can recommend are Western Lines of Scotland and the Corus Railway, along with the LMS3F Ginty and Corus expansion pack. If you want to try something from the freeware scene, I recommend the LNER Y7 and Peckett W4 tank engines along with the West of England mainline. The Y7 and W4 were modelled by, and are available to download from, Wayside Works, while the West of England mainline is available on Golden Age Development's website. Although the WOFE, or WOFE as I call it, does have some payware requirements, all of them are easy to find on Steam. Even though I'm not familiar with realistic operating practices on the WOFE, and its branches, this is still one of my favourite freeware routes because of the excellent scenery and extensive non-linear layout. And that's the lot. Even though I couldn't get to every single question, this video still ended up being much longer than expected. Hopefully I gave satisfactory answers, and that you all found this video interesting. I'd say it probably had the widest variety of footage I've ever included in a single video. I don't know what else to say for now, aside from thanking you all for continuing to watch my silly content after all this time.